Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. When we talk about global poverty, it is so incredibly easy to feel completely overwhelmed, right? We hear these staggering statistics about billions of people struggling, and our immediate instinct is usually just to think, wow, this problem is way too massive, it's too deeply entrenched to ever actually solve. But today, we're going to try something different. We are going to radically shift our focus away from those grand, sweeping ideologies and just zero in on real human behavior. We're unpacking some really groundbreaking insights from the book Poor Economics by Abhijit V. Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And their central argument is honestly profound. If we want to fight poverty effectively, we have to stop guessing and start actually understanding the everyday constraints that the world's poorest people face.
So, I want you to imagine something for just a second. Imagine living in a place like Miami or Modesto, which you only have exactly 99 cents a day. That tiny amount has to cover literally all of your everyday needs, except for housing. So, what's the very first thing you'd buy? Well, your immediate thought is probably just bulk food to survive, right? Rice, beans, maybe some cheap bananas. You would logically assume that every single penny would go toward getting as many calories as humanly possible just to stay alive. But as we're going to see, that assumption, which, by the way, drives a massive amount of global aid policy, is actually fundamentally flawed.
Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo point out a pretty devastating truth. They wrote, "This urge to reduce the poor to a set of cliches has been with us for as long as there has been poverty. For far too long, the poor have been reduced to, well, basically cartoon characters. They're usually painted as either tragically helpless victims or these nobly self-sufficient heroes. But the reality? The reality is that the poor are just like everyone else, except they just have a lot less money. And precisely because they have so little, they have to be incredibly sophisticated economists just to survive from one day to the next."
Now, when experts argue about how to help, they usually fall into one of two camps. And honestly, both are desperately looking for a magic bullet. On one side, you have the big push ideology, championed by folks like Jeffrey Sachs. This view basically argues that poor countries are stuck in a vicious trap, and only massive foreign aid can kickstart a virtuous cycle of wealth. On the other side, you have the free markets camp, heavily promoted by experts like William Easterly. They argue that aid is actually corrupting, that it does more harm than good, and that free markets alone will naturally solve the problem. But honestly, this whole debate is often just way too abstract. Because this massive debate really boils down to one fundamental question. Are people actually trapped? Think of it like two different paths. One path looks like an S-shaped curve. In this scenario, if you start out extremely poor, your future income is actually lower than your income today. You are literally trapped, and you desperately need a big push to get over that initial hump. But then, consider the other path, an inverted L-shaped curve. Here, your income grows fastest at the very beginning. If the world actually works like this, there is no trap, and people can naturally grow their way out of poverty over time. So, which path represents reality? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at how people actually behave, starting with our most basic human need, food.
If a true hunger-based poverty trap exists, a situation where people literally cannot work because they are starving, logic totally dictates they should spend every spare penny on maximizing cheap calories. But here is the puzzle. They don't. When extremely poor people get a little bit of extra money, they don't just buy more cheap grains to max out their caloric intake. They actually buy better-tasting, more expensive calories. Or even more surprisingly, they skip the food aisle entirely and buy something else.
Check this out. Data from Udaipur, India reveals something totally unexpected. A typical poor household there could increase their food budget by up to 30% if they just cut out other discretionary spending. But they don't. They choose to spend a massive chunk, around 14% of their budget, on festivals, along with a pretty significant amount on sugar, tobacco, and alcohol. Why? Because extra money doesn't just go to bulk calories. It goes to things that offer dignity, a sense of community, and honestly, things that just make life a little less boring.
This brilliantly illustrates what economists call a flight to quality. The famous author George Orwell actually noticed this exact same behavior among the British poor during the Depression. He noted they survived on sugared tea and white bread rather than healthier, cheaper alternatives. And we see the exact same thing in modern data. There was this fascinating experiment in China where researchers heavily subsidized basic staples like rice and wheat for extremely poor households. You'd think they would buy a ton of it to stock up, right? Actually, feeling slightly richer because of the subsidy, they bought less of the cheap staple. They used the extra cash to buy shrimp and meat. They wanted tastier food, not just more food.
What we really have to realize here is that things that make life less boring are a massive, totally understandable priority. Think about it. If you live in extreme poverty, you are incredibly skeptical that any massive transformative life change is ever really coming. You don't see a clear path to suddenly becoming wealthy, so why subject yourself to a perfectly optimized but completely miserable diet? You focus on the here and now. You prioritize a television, a special family celebration, or even just a cup of sugary tea, because those things bring immediate joy and a sense of humanity to an otherwise incredibly difficult existence.
So this totally rational focus on the present brings us to our next massive puzzle: healthcare. Things like water purification drops, free immunizations, or highly subsidized insecticide-treated bed nets to prevent malaria. These are incredibly cheap, easy ways to save lives. Yet, they're often completely ignored by the poor. Why on earth would someone skip a free vaccine that could literally save their child's life?
The answer comes down to human psychology, specifically something called time inconsistency. It's this universal human tendency to heavily value the present moment over the future. It's the exact same reason we promise ourselves, I am absolutely going to the gym tomorrow, but when tomorrow actually rolls around, we just sit on the couch and watch TV. For a mother living in poverty, walking 2 hours in the blazing heat to a clinic today to get a vaccine for a disease her child might get in the future, that is a massive cost borne entirely today for an invisible benefit way off in the future. So she procrastinates. We all do.
So how do we actually overcome these deeply ingrained human behaviors? Well, the authors championed a method borrowed directly from medical science, the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. Instead of just endlessly debating grand theories in a comfortable university office, researchers actually go out into the field, randomly assign different villages to different programs, and rigorously measure exactly what happens in the real world.
To see how these RCTs work in practice, let's look at the massive debate around bed nets for malaria. Some experts insisted you absolutely had to give them away for free to save lives. Others argued vehemently that no, if you give them away, people won't value them. They'll just use them as wedding veils or fishing nets, and you'll destroy the local market. So, a researcher named Pascaline Dupas ran an RCT in Kenya. She literally just offered bed nets at various subsidized prices to see what people would actually do in real life.
The RCTs revealed that people are highly sensitive to price. Even a tiny nominal cost drastically reduces the number of people who will get a bed net. But if you give it away for free, they do use it for its intended purpose, and they don't waste it. Even more amazing, RCTs showed you can use tiny nudges to overcome human nature in time inconsistency. In India, researchers offered mothers a tiny immediate reward, just 2 pounds of dal, which are lentils, when they brought their child in for an immunization. That tiny immediate reward was enough to overcome the procrastination. Immunization rates absolutely skyrocketed, just from a bag of lentils.
So we clearly see how human psychology affects health decisions, but what about money? Why don't the poor save more? We know for a fact they understand the desperate need to save. Farmers know they need money for fertilizer next season. Parents know the immense value of keeping their kids in school. Yet actually accumulating those savings is incredibly difficult. Why is that?
Well, think about how much those of us in the developed world rely on what we can call invisible nudges. If you live in a wealthy country, you don't have to consciously decide to purify your water every single morning. It just comes out of the tap, already chlorinated. You don't have to constantly exert immense willpower to save for retirement. It's just automatically deducted into a 401k before you even see the paycheck. The poor have absolutely none of this invisible infrastructure. Every single day requires an exhausting series of deliberate choices just to survive, meaning they have to draw upon their limited endowment of self-control constantly, all day long.
And this constant heavy burden takes a very real physiological toll. Studies show that living in the precariousness of poverty dramatically increases cortisol levels, which is the body's primary stress hormone. Elevated cortisol directly impairs cognitive function and the prefrontal cortex, which just so happens to be the exact part of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term planning. When you are highly stressed, fighting just to survive the week, it is biologically much harder to resist the temptation to spend money on a tiny bit of immediate relief rather than saving it for some distant, uncertain future.
But because the poor are incredibly sophisticated, they know they have self-control problems, and they invent exceptionally clever ways to force themselves to save. They form rotating savings and credit associations, where everyone chips in weekly and one person takes the pot, creating strict social pressure to save. Farmers will buy fertilizer immediately after harvest when they actually have the cash, essentially freezing their assets in physical goods before they can spend the money on something else. Or, my favorite, they save by literally building a house, one single brick at a time over a span of years.
So distilling years of these experiments across the globe, the authors leave us with a few key lessons to radically rethink poverty. First, information gaps distort decisions. People often just don't know the invisible benefits of something like a vaccine. Second, the poor bear way too much daily responsibility without the automatic, supportive systems that we take for granted. Third, they lack crucial markets like reliable health insurance to protect against sudden shocks. Fourth, bad institutions can actually be fixed step by step. Countries aren't just inherently doomed. And finally, expectations are incredibly powerful. If you don't believe you can escape poverty, you simply won't make the painful investments to try.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to take away from this explainer. When we look at the surprising choices the poor make, our first instinct is often to judge them. But take a hard look at your own life. How many of your own smart choices, your retirement savings, your perfectly clean water, your easily accessible healthcare, are actually your own brilliant, disciplined decisions? And how many are just the result of living in a system meticulously built to protect you from your own human nature? Understanding people's actual constraints rather than blaming them is the only real way we can begin to design evidence-based solutions that actually fight poverty.